Welcome to part 2 of low back. Your back is fucked.
Yes.
Uh,
Probably
we,
because you don't know how to do
yeah,
it.
the first part of this episode was just kind of the perspective of what I find in practice as to why your back is jacked up. And this second part is how you can kind of train yourself out of it. And this is from the perspective of a strength and conditioning coach. The first question I would ask you is, what are the most common, movement faults that you see in, let's just, because you were a CrossFit or owned a CrossFit gym,
Yeah.
what are the most common faults that you see? Let's start with squatting. What is the first 4 or 5 common movement faults that you see when people are squatting? Front squat, back squat.
Yeah. So generally when I'm watching someone squat, like they're new to the gym, I'm looking for a couple things. First, I'm looking at how good they are at bracing the spine throughout the movement. So if you're a coach and you want to know how to have a better eye for movement, the easiest thing you can do is you can watch their shirt. And what you're looking for is the shirt changes how many wrinkles throughout the movement.
Elaborate that. What do you mean?
So if you arch your back, your shirt on your back will wrinkle more. When you hunch over, your shirt will flatten out. So it's a little trick that I use as someone's moving up and down through a squat. I'm looking at how often the consistency of the shirt is changing.
Oh, so you're looking at this from behind.
From the side.
Okay.
Profile, because I want to see, sometimes there's very, very small changes in the spine, flexion extension, that a little can cause an injury. It's not always like a real, like, exaggerated, like, ooh, or they're looking like a snake. A lot of times it's just small little hip tucks overextending at the top. And so I'm looking for movement in the spine throughout the movement.
And we're looking for not a lot of movement, really.
Correct. It could just be a small amount. The
Right.
goal is there shouldn't be any movement.
That's what I was trying to get to.
Right. There should be no movement in the spine. And that's the most common thing that I see is people not knowing how to move their hips and knees and ankles without the spine also coming along for the ride.
Right, which goes back to my talk about global movement and segmental movement. When we are squatting, we should be moving as a whole, global.
Right.
And there shouldn't be really a ton of movement coming from your lumbar spine.
Correct.
So what are some things that you could do if you do catch yourself moving in the lumbar spine? What are some of the things that you can do to train yourself out of that?
Right. So this is assuming that the person has all the requisite mobility. So I've tested everything. I know they are capable. We'll go into what happens when they're not. But if they are capable of getting themselves into all these positions, and I know it's just a movement issue, then the easiest thing is a combination of cueing and then repetition slowly. So cueing might just be making them aware of the fact that they need to actually hold a brace for the entirety of the movement. So breathing in, holding that breath, and then bracing. And when you think brace, it's your entire trunk all the way around. So not just your abs. You don't just want to flex your abs. That's not bracing. I use the analogy of you got your hands up in the air, you got 10 people surrounding you, and you're going to say, hey, all 10 of these people are about to just start pummeling you. What would you do to like brace for that impact? You're squeezing the entirety of your trunk.
There are actually some techniques out there where what I usually do is I get like a band, if they're small enough, and I'll put it around their torso.
And then have them stretch the band.
And then have them stretch the band.
Yeah.
And that's a great way of understanding. Or what I'll do sometimes is I'll get a strap that's like a buckle strap, and I'll put 4 tennis balls, 2 in the front and then 2 in the back, and I say,
Create pressure.
You have to create pressure on those 4 points.
Yeah, that's a really good drill.
Yeah, and so that's another way of understanding what bracing is, because I find it that kinesthetically
hmm
humans have a hard time, especially if you're a beginner,
Conceptualizing
what
just off
bracing
of a verbal
feels like.
cue.
And just as a little bit, just an add on why bracing is really important is because it's transferring forces. You're
Right.
transferring, when you think about trying to transfer a force between a uncooked spaghetti stick versus a cooked noodle stick.
Right.
Like there's no transference, but there is some transference from a very rigid spaghetti stick. So
Correct.
that's why bracing is so important. And that's my favorite way of really teaching a beginner.
Right.
If you are quite advanced, then you can just mentally think about it. And
Right.
then,
You could just tell someone, hey, like you're putting a dowel rod in a bucket and you're filling it up with cement, and the
Mhm.
bucket is your hips.
Yeah.
So once that cement is solid, when I move the bucket, if I move it anteriorly, posteriorly, the dowel rod's just gonna swing up and down, and it's gonna stay connected.
So that's the first cue. What is another movement fault that you might see in a squat?
So the other movement fault is the torso angle changing drastically in the wrong order, meaning you'll see people raise their hips first and then their spine, their trunk, or they will lift their trunk up first and then try to come up with their hips. So the goal is, I said it a little bit, mentioned it a little bit in the previous episode, but the ankle, knee, and hip, they should be opening and closing like an accordion at the same rate. So your torso angle really should be pretty much the same for a majority of the movement. It's only at the very end when the hips are starting to open that you'll see the torso really rise up.
So the accordion, what you're saying, is really in lieu of or in association of the hip, knee, and ankle.
Correct.
So the change of hip flexion, knee flexion, and ankle flexion.
Yeah, and it's all physics, right? Like you were talking about levers. So if I get to the bottom of a squat, a lot of times people can squat down properly.
Mhm.
It's coming up out of that squat. So a lot of times what you'll see is, and this can be a strength issue, capacity issue, they will avoid a position because it's weak. And so they will try to load the tissue that's strongest. And so you'll see people dump forward into the knees. If they're weak in the posterior, you'll see people sway back. They'll do like the stripper move where you're like throwing your butt back and up to get the hamstrings loaded enough so you feel strong again to then finish the movement. So you'll see those movement faults. It's generally, I'm looking at how much the torso angle is changing. So this would be someone who maybe they don't have any type of flexion extension issue, but when they're squatting, I'm noticing like if my elbow's the hip and my fist is my shoulders, I'm looking for any like exaggeration of change of movement this way versus it coming up steady.
So how do we train that?
So I'm a huge fan of eccentrics because when you can control a movement, it's a great way of creating that kinesthetic awareness because you have more time under tension, more time for the whole system to kind of get a feel for where you are in space. And that tempo can also be done concentrically as well. So I'll do like a 5-5-5, meaning 5 seconds down, 5-second hold, 5-second up. And so the idea here is to slow the movement down, remove any type of overflow where you're kind of overdoing past your capacity because of speed. So a lot of times speed and intensity will put an athlete over their capacity. Slowing them down requires the weight to be a little bit lighter and they can really drill the form.
Can you go over a little bit of the difference between what an eccentric is and a concentric is?
Yeah, so eccentric is you're moving with gravity. So regardless of if the movement starts at the top or the bottom, the eccentric portion is when you are going with gravity down. So if it's a pull up, you're pulling up, that's concentric. As you lower, that's eccentric. When you're deadlifting, you pull it up into your hip, that's concentric. You start lowering it back to the ground, gravity's pulling you back down. That's eccentric.
Okay. It's kind of not the right definition.
What do you mean?
Eccentric is when you are trying to lengthen the tissue.
Right. In a global movement, eccentric is, it's easy to just remember you're going down versus you're going up. But an eccentric from a force perspective, it's a tissue that's loaded that's being forced to then lengthen.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that's like the
Yeah.
real definition. It doesn't matter if it's going down or up. It matters that the tissue is shortened in a
Right.
shortened position, and you are overloading it. That it's
Right. So like if you had, the direction of force you could change it obviously with directions of bands. So
Yeah.
then the eccentric force would be, a different direction than
Yeah,
gravity.
gravity.
But if I have a problem with, I put things in the perspective of like Olympic lifting. So like barbell is on the ground. You got to make it go up.
But
So yeah,
there's
but so for those that I might have confused, that is the proper definition is a tissue that's being
under
flexed
shortened.
and versus
Yeah.
under load and then being lengthened.
Yeah. So again, to be more clear, eccentric means when your tissue is in a shortened position under load,
Mhm.
and the load is more than your tissue can handle, and you're going into it's lengthening while
Right.
you're trying to shorten it. And the concentric is when the muscle is shortening. So you are trying
It's
to
lengthened
from
and then
A
you're
to
shortening.
B, you're trying to shorten that distance.
And the reason why we will use in training, we will use more or less of those two movements has a lot to do with the force on the tendon, the attachment. We get much more adaptation out of the tissue in eccentric movements.
And what you're saying is to sync this movement to get you back to making sure that everything is moving at the timing is correctly. Is what we do is one of the things we talk about in the clinic, which is a principle of mine, is you have to earn speed.
Absolutely.
So tempo allows us to slow everything down. So this means you're not doing your 80% one rep max.
No.
You're maybe in your 50%, and you're doing it time under load, and you're doing it very slowly so that you can be kinesthetically aware of where your hip, knee, and ankle and torso is in space. You can't know that when you just fucking do it with velocity.
Correct. And all beginners, every beginner program every movement should be at tempo.
And not to mention on the medical, the therapy side of this is when you do things under tension and you do things with eccentric load, you're making the ligaments and the tendons stronger. So you're making yourself more resilient to the movement in the sense of you're preventing injury because you're increasing your capacity, which is what we talked about in the last video or in the last podcast. So I really love if you're specifically beginners out there, don't do things fast.
No, time under tension.
Time under tension, do it very slow.
Correct.
So those are like two things that you could easily do to fix your squat, which is making sure that your torso is in and understanding bracing
neutral the entire time.
And then two is making sure that the movement is in sync, meaning that your hips, knees, and ankles are moving the way that they need to be doing. And we do that under tension.
Correct.
Okay, so the most other common movement that people associate back pain with is
deadlift.
Deadlift. So what are some movement issues that you see most commonly in a deadlift?
So the biggest issue more often than not is related to a lack of hamstring mobility. And what I mean by that is the hamstring is pulling so tight on the pelvis that the pelvis is stuck in a posterior tilt. So if I'm standing up and I tuck my butt underneath me, that's posterior tilt. If I take my pelvis and I pull it forward so the hip pointers on the front side, if those are angling and pointing down to the ground, that's anterior tilt. So when you are in a deadlift, when you are about to pick it up, the pelvis should be anteriorly rotated enough that the spine is in that neutral position. People forget that your spine doesn't just stop at the top of your hip, it runs down through. I mean, we used to have a tail at some point. So if it's tilted, that means those lower vertebrae are going to end up taking a lot more stress than they should. So in the previous episode, we talked about disc issues. If you want to put a lot of force and load in a direction you don't want those discs to go, deadlift with the low back rounded. Like you're just going to put a ton of pressure into that area. So we want to make sure that those discs are in a very nice, happy spot in the middle. And so what I'm always looking for, the first movement flaw that I'm looking for when someone's setting up for a deadlift is, do I see the butt tucked underneath? And this creates a lot of problems for the lift. When the hamstring is not stretched, it can't load properly. And so more often than not, it's not always just a mobility, it's a strength issue. And so the brain is nervous to let the hamstring open and relax because that lengthened position feels dangerous. And so when people start to hinge over, they will resist that motion of opening up the hamstring because their brain's like, I'm going to tear. So they'll hold on. And so a lot of times I'm having to remind people to let the hamstring stretch.
Yeah. And this goes back to what you said at the beginning, which was if you do things slowly, let me repeat that one more time. Slowly, then you won't tear. Like another principle is at the sports bod is you're never going to fuck yourself up if you do things slowly and intentionally and with not a lot of load. And so if you're learning how to do this and you know that this is a fault of yours, which is you can't keep your back in a neutral position when you, even as easy as like touching your toes, right? That hinge position, then you know you have to do this slowly and you have to do it with very light load and learn to neurologically turn off that like defensive mechanism of I'm going to tear my hamstring because you're not.
Yeah. So that's number one. I'm looking at the orientation, how flexed the hip is. And so there's cues that I use a lot with that. I'll say pancake your hands between your upper thigh and the 2 points of your pelvis. If you are in a posterior tilt, there's going to be a wider angle. When you're in deep hip flexion, that's much more of an anterior tilt in a deadlift. So there's a smaller gap there. So that's an easy cue that I'll use with people. The other major flaw has to do with the positioning of where the barbell is underneath you. Your arms or ropes or chains, however you want to think about it, attaching you to that bar. We all know what happens if you've ever gone into an office and you see the little ball bearings attached to strings. If you pull it back this way and let go, it's going to swing like a pendulum. If the weight is not properly balanced under like the balance point underneath you, when you break from the ground, the second that weight comes off the floor, if it's too far back or too far forward, you're going to see that pendulum effect. Most of the time, you'll see people pick weights up too far away from them. And so that puts more force and load in the low back. And it also is going to make it harder and heavier. Like if I'm trying to pick something up, I'm going to stand over it. I'm not going to like go reach out for something heavy out in front of me and try to lift it up. I know inherently that's going to feel heavier. It's the same thing with a deadlift. It's got to be close to you. When you're looking at the orientation from the side, people forget that the way the shoulder is attached, your scapula, there's so much in that upper back that's actually where the foundation is. So you'll see people, they'll line it up where they think their shoulder is, but really it should be by the armpit, like closer to where the scap is in your back. That is the point that you should be looking at.
And really what you're talking about is center of gravity, right?
Yeah, center of gravity.
We want the center of gravity over the bar, not away from the bar should not be away from your center of gravity, either too far in front or too far behind.
And in Olympic lifting, this is like a heavily studied thing. It's you have yourself, your center of gravity, you have the bar's center of gravity. And so together, when you're holding that bar, there's a combined center of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
And you're trying to get those things to be as close together as possible. There are different points during the lift where they should overlap. There are different points of the lift where they're going to be further apart. So the sooner we can marry those center of gravities together, the better.
I mean, one of my other favorite cues for that while you're lifting is where should you feel the weight in your feet?
So in the deadlift, it should be dead center. Like you should be gripping the floor with your toes. It should not be pushed to the heel. It should not be pushed to the toe. It should be the middle of the foot,
right?
A little bit behind the ball of the foot.
I think that's the most miscued cue. Is that?
Yeah, and I think it comes from, CrossFit has done a lot of good because it's gotten people lifting more than anyone ever lifted before. The problem is you have a lot of inexperienced coaches going to 2-3 day seminars, and it's easy to fix a lot of issues by going with something like, just, weight back in the heels. You tend to give people cues based on like what the majority of people do, but sometimes that can be to a fault because when you tell someone the weight should be in their heels, they're much more likely to have a higher hip position, and they're much more likely to try to lift like this versus stand. So it's so important. Like when you're lifting off the ground, you're pushing the earth away from you.
Yes, I think what the people who are listening to the podcast don't know that you were swinging your hand like this, which is
this is my torso.
Right. No one can see that in the podcast.
Yeah,
they're listening. So
it's a good point. So I was just moving my forearm.
What he's explaining is a hinge position. So like, imagine if you're bowing, like a Japanese bow. That's what most people think a deadlift is like getting from that bow position to an erect position. And that's not what a deadlift is.
No, that's what a good morning is.
That's what a good morning is. And that's what I think most people confuse the movement of a deadlift, and that's where they get into trouble, right? Because they think that they think that the deadlift is just a hinge through their back, and it's
not.
Could not be further.
No, you are actively pressing down into the floor, and there's knee extension, there's hip extension.
Yeah, what's the Disney where the sword is stuck in the rock?
Sword in the Stone.
Okay. You don't bow and then try to get good morning. You try to get underneath that sword 2 feet under, and you're pushing against the rock and pulling up. That's really what the motion of a deadlift is.
What is the name of that movie? It's not Sword in the Stone, is it?
No, I don't know what it is though.
Gosh darn it!
But we all know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that is the most common. And then how do we train that?
Right. So there are so many different like accessory movements that you can do. The easiest thing is during the setup, you're trying to conform to the bar versus trying to roll the bar into some preset position you have. Everyone is shaped differently. The ratio of your arm to leg to torso, all of these things matter from like a geometry standpoint. So you never want to take advice from a coach that is trying to fit you to a specific form, like a textbook picture of what they think a deadlift should look like. I have people with their backs look basically parallel to the ground. I have people with much more upright torsos, all because I'm trying to put them in a position that allows them the best force production based on their levers, their arms and their legs. So when I'm setting someone up from a deadlift, the bar stays where the bar is, and we are conforming to the bar. And so when you're trying to start this process, it's the same as the the squat. We're trying to move very slowly. And as they're pulling the bar from the ground, I like to use the cue like you're squeezing the bar off the ground versus lifting. So the amount of force that you're putting into the ground should be very consistent and slow at first so that you can see and feel if there's any movement in the bar away from you, if you feel like the bar is coming into you. If you're scraping your shins, that's a great indicator that the bar is too close, right? So as we move up, the the body should be moving around the bar. Like I shouldn't have to move the bar out and around my knees and then back into my hips. My knees should be moving back out of the way and then back in front of the bar on the way up.
So this leads me to my next question, which is one of the most common reasons why you will have back pain is this kind of imbalance between your quads and your hamstrings. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more about what that means and what I was trying to talk about?
So people with very strong quads, weaker hamstrings, they tend to squat their deadlift. So you'll see them try to set up with a much lower hip because they're basically trying to push into the ground and lift upright like it's a squat. In a deadlift, we're trying to lengthen the posterior chain to a point where the hamstrings are the most loaded. The quads are utilized in a deadlift, but the hamstring and glutes are the primary movers. They're your biggest hip extenders. So when you look at a sprinter, right, you're going to notice when you sprint, you are violently opening the hip over and over and over, and that force you're generating by opening the hip is what propels you forward. The muscles that are responsible for that are your glutes and your hamstrings. So that's why sprinters have a huge butt, huge hamstrings. In other sports, you'll notice that involve much more knee extension. You're going to see much more quad development in those athletes. So when I'm setting someone up, it's very important to see where they start to compensate throughout the movement. And this is where it's really important to be using the right weight. So like, as you were saying in the previous episode, capacity could be the tissue's ability to handle a certain amount of load. And then it could be a system of what's the endurance of that tissue? Like how many times can I move that weight in a certain period of time? In deadlifts, when we're talking about heavier weights, you'll see that compensation shift forward or back based on where that athlete has more strength. So it's important for the coach to be able to visualize that and know this is too much weight. They're not capable of maintaining a proper position during the lift because the tissue of their hamstring and glute is not strong enough to hold the position properly.
All this to say is that mainly your deadlift is a posterior chain
Yes.
exercise. And when we talk about what a posterior chain is, it's the muscles of your low back, the glute muscles, the hamstrings,
Right.
and the calves, and also the bottom of your feet. And oftentimes we are very strong in the front.
Correct.
And not very strong in the back, which is this asymmetry, and the body does not like asymmetries.
No, it does not.
So what are some tools that we can do to first maybe do some accessory movements and maybe explain what an accessory movement is?
So you had talked about global movements, right? A lot of times an accessory movement is something that's a little bit more focused to one joint. And so we utilize things like good morning, where we can purposely stress hip flexion, and we can get the athlete to really feel what it's like at a more drastic end range of their hamstring. So I love good mornings. I like hip extensions, GHD hip extensions. If you've never seen that device, you're laying in a prone position, stomach down. Your feet are in a device that has them locked in and anchored, and you are moving through the hip. So you're letting the hip anteriorly rotate, and so your torso and hips are coming down towards the ground. So at the end of a hip extension, you look like a 90-degree right angle. And then you pull and squeeze through the hamstrings and the glutes to bring the hip and the trunk up together. So GHD hip extensions, good mornings. And then we can get even more precise with like objects like a dumbbell or a kettlebell. We can do single leg RDLs. We can start to really focus on the tissue that we want to strengthen.
And I think this is a really important juncture to kind of talk about, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. But one of the things that is a thorough through for all of the types of lifters, right? No matter where you are, and this is really specifically for beginners, you need to understand what your 1 rep max is and what the volume should be. So can you explain what a 1 rep max is and how do we figure that out first?
Right. So the toughest thing for a coach is with a beginner, their 1 rep max is going to be changing daily, just because their capacity for change and adaptation is very, very high. The more advanced the lifter, it requires a ton of very specific force to create adaptation at the end of your, like, if you're a much more trained athlete. So I like to operate with younger or newer lifters. I like to do a lot of daily maxes, and so we call those heavies. So the goal here is to work up to something where you feel like you're starting to get into the mode where you are reaching the capacity for proper movement. That will give you an indicator of the percentage to use for the working sets. So a lot of times with beginner athletes, they'll spend 10, 15 minutes working up to something that's difficult. And that could change daily. Some days it might be higher, some days it might be less. And then we take a percentage of that daily heavy and we basically lay in some volume.
Yeah. And I would say for you beginners, you probably don't have a coach. So what I would tell you to do in a most safe way is you working up to that weight. Perceived exertion is really important here. So 0 to 10, 10 being like, I'm about to pass out and I think I'm going to break every bone in my body from lifting this weight. And 0 being like, I can do this in my sleep.
Right.
Once you get to, there are lots of websites out there. You can also ask ChatGPT, which is you get to an exertion level of 7 or 8 and you just note what the weight is and you note how many reps you did. You put that into ChatGPT or you put that into the website of figuring out what your 1 rep max is. And now that daily, you have an actual percentage, right? Now you have an understanding of what your 1 rep max is. And then that 1 rep max is your 10 out of 10 exertion. And you're working now percentages from that 1 rep max. As a beginner, where should we be on the 1 rep max percentage wise? While we're training.
Yeah. So the majority of your training should be in the 75 to 85% range. So if you're doing a 6 or 8 week cycle, that is your bread and butter. Your body is going to get the best combination of volume and intensity, and you're going to see the most adaptation and change in those percentages. If we're looking at like, a lot of things fall on a bell curve, right? So just think of it as a bell curve. The center of the bell is where you're going to spend the majority of your time. There are going to be parts of the cycle where you're beat the hell up. You're tired, you've been training hard. And so you're going to be on the left side of the bell curve in that 40, 50, 60% range. And then ideally, if you prime yourself properly, training's going well, you're trying to catch that moment where you're recovered enough at the end to then work to the right of the bell curve and hit the 90 to 100% range.
And then maybe explain and elaborate a little bit more about volume. Like what does a proper set and rep look like for a beginner?
Generally, I like 5x5. And 5x5 at about 80% is a very, very repeatable volume for most people. If you're younger, you can probably handle a little bit more in the 30, 35 total reps. So you could maybe do a couple more sets of 5. If you are a little older, you've been training longer, your volume might look a little lower at those percentages. And not to go off on too much of a tangent, but everyone has a top end max that they're capable of genetically, right? When you're a beginner, where that potential is way higher than where you're working at. So it doesn't tax you enough. Even if, like you said, even if it's an RP of 10, that RP of 10 is relative to what your genetic potential is. So it's still not stressing the CNS, the central nervous system, as much as, say, someone who's been training and competing for 20 years, they have like reached that max. So when they do 90%, it is a true 90%. That is going to wipe them out. So you really have to just understand that the younger you are in your training age, you can handle more volume at higher percentages. The longer you've been training, you're going to handle less volume at higher percentages.
Yeah, I think from a medical perspective, 80% is quite aggressive. If we're talking about making sure that you don't fuck up your low back, because you're training at a high percentage there, so and that's a lot of volume. That's 5x5 is a lot of volume. So I would recommend like a 5x, or 3x5. You're never gonna really fuck yourself up if you're doing a 3x5 at 70%, and you're just like slow.
Right.
And I think what's also really important to understand is macro cycles, meaning a microcycle could be what you're doing in the day or in the next 3 days, and a macrocycle is what you're doing in 6 weeks. And in 6 weeks, you could be slowly progressing from 70% 1 week, 75% the next week, 80.
Which is
85.
why with people that are new to lifting, most of the time we put them on a linear progression, just because that allows us to stair step along the way. And beginning athletes, they respond very well to linear progression. That just means that you do 25 pounds on day 1, and the next week you do 35, the next week, and you just keep going up until you reach a point where you're no longer able to increase. There are so many tools in a programmer's toolbox when it comes to finding the right way for the individual to get the most out of their lifting. So we talked a little bit about like working up to a heavy. On the flip side, sometimes we'll do like daily rep maxes. Instead of like trying to find what's heavy for that day, we'll say, hey, let's just pick a medium weight. How many times can you do that weight before form breaks down? And so if you get 10 reps at 135, I know, and you could ask ChatGPT, like, hey, generally, I've been lifting for 2 years. I deadlifted 135 for 10. Where is my max? There are charts and tables that have been researched for a long, long time that are pretty solid. So most of the time, 95% is going to be about 2 to 3 reps for most people. 85%, 5, 6, 7 reps. So if you do 10, I can extrapolate out what your max probably is based on how many reps you were able to do at something.
Okay, so last question, as we are kind of wrapping up the episode. What are some of the things that you find are common kind of nutritional faults and other maybe variables that aren't necessarily mechanical lifting that may be contributing to why you might be getting injured while you're doing this stuff? I know the list could be long, but let's
I'm going to go over 2 things.
Give me three.
Three things.
Give me 3 things. Number one,
you got to sleep. Your body requires sleep to recover. Not all 8 hours are equal. So if you go to bed from 12 to 8 a.m., that is not as high quality as 10 to 6. Your body's hormones, everything operates off of a circadian rhythm, which means our bodies kind of handle things based on the rising and setting of the sun. So it's a 24-hour clock. So certain processes in the body happen at certain times of the day. If you miss out on that opportunity by going to sleep too late, you don't just get that to happen at a different time. You already missed it. So that's one.
So let me just give you a little vignette. Like, what if you had your second baby and you're not necessarily sleeping and you don't have a night nurse and you still do want to train,
Right.
and you're not necessarily having the greatest sleep, but you also need it as a stress reliever.
Right.
And I do believe that moving is better than not moving.
Absolutely.
So what are things that we can adapt
Correct.
to the training to, again, knowing that we don't have a lot of sleep, but we still want to train?
Right. So the rule of thumb here is the less recovered you are, the more beat up you are, the less sleep you have. The movement selection should be less complex. So you should only be doing things that are slow. There's not a lot of like explosiveness, not a lot of agility involved, not a lot of complex movements happening in a short amount of time. Don't go into the gym and start snatching. Like, do some accessory drills, lower your percentages by 10%, and just move. Like, the goal here is just to get some work done, not to set PRs.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, yeah.
Okay, number 2. What is a second nutritional or variable?
Hydration. Your cells, your muscle cells in the body require water to function properly. So if you are dehydrated, the tissue is much more likely to fail on you. You'll see people cramp. You'll see people, tear things simply because their tissue is not full of the nutrients it needs. So we can go down a whole list of other like micronutrients, antioxidants, all that stuff, minerals, but we'll just start with the biggest low-hanging fruit. You have to drink a lot of water.
I think this is a great thing that you just said that, because that's something that I missed in the last episode, which is your disc is basically like 90% water. So
yeah.
If you're coming in on a fucking max lift day without being dehydrated, guess what? Your disc are going to fucking explode.
Yeah. You are creating undue oxidative stress on every tissue in the body when you chronically deprive it of water and also other nutrients.
Okay, number 3. Last but not least.
Okay, number 3, not properly warming up.
Ooh.
So tissue needs to be worked before you require a high level of activity from it. So one of my biggest frustrations with people is you'll see people do like these static hold stretches. They're not actually like practicing the movement. The best way to prepare for a movement is to do the movement. So this could look like some segmented variations of the movement. It could be just a barbell. You have to work the tissue, which means flexing it, extending it, flexing it, extending it, getting blood flow into the tissue. You should feel sweaty and really warm before you start putting a lot of load on the body.
I mean, I'm so glad that you also brought this up, which is the question that I get asked at the clinic a lot is, should I be stretching before and after? And I say, 1, you should never stretch before, mainly because there was a study between 2 soccer teams, professional soccer teams. One soccer team didn't warm up and they warmed up, but they didn't do any type of stretching. And then the other team did stretching, and the team that did stretching over the course of the season had more injuries than the ones that didn't do the stretching. So that's 1. Number 2 is, you're right. What people do for warm-ups is fucking absolutely absurd. Okay, swinging your leg back and forth is not a fucking warm-up. No. You have to neurologically prime your body to be able to do a squat or a deadlift or whatever you're doing that day. So and this is for the coaches out there too. You have to warm up the actual movement. You can't expect your kids or your athletes to just immediately snap into the movement that you want them to.
Right.
You have to fucking and this is also a great time to cue your athletes of like, this is the movement that we're going to be doing. This is what we want to be like practicing right now. Get the form stuff out of the way so that when we are actually doing a performance type of lift, you don't have to coach as hard.
Correct. A good warm-up has stages to it. You have a very general stage that might just look like hopping on a bike or a rower. You're just moving, doing some double unders. You're just trying to get blood flow and get the body hotter, right? Because warm tissue stretches much more easily. So that would be phase 1 or stage 1 of your warm-up. The next stage would be to start reclaiming any mobility you know you need for the movement. So very specific mobility exercises to open things up and reclaim mobility. But once you've reclaimed that mobility in that position, you have to then work the position. So after you've done those mobility exercises, you're then going to start working through that tissue slowly, then ballistically. Once you get through that stage, the final stage is doing the movement, practicing the movement. You need to make sure, and that's like your last chance to identify, should I go further? Like, should I start loading up this deadlift?
I mean, that's why also it's so important to understand what your percentages are, because if you know what your percentages are, then you can work in your 30%, 40%, knowing that that's your warm up. You're not going to fuck anything up. You can do it slow. You can really practice on the form at that percentage. And like anything in life, the more prepared you are, the more data that you have, the better you're going to be able to perform, and the end result is going to be better. So those are some of the great things that you've recommended. If you want to get some more information or you want to see some of these movements, Coach Eric has a ton of content on our YouTube page, which is www.youtube.com/the sports pod.
In CapCut, I learned how to place links.
Okay, so he's gonna also place a link, and then click on follow us on Instagram. And if you liked what you heard today, hit that follow button.
This is SP Cast, Humans Fixing Humans.